Assalamu alaikum. As we come towards the end of the holy month of Ramadan, we are also coming to 6 months of the latest assault by the Israeli occupation forces on the besieged strip of Gaza. As we all know, these last 6 months have been a horrific spectacle that the entire world has witnessed. It isn't the first time that Gaza has been under assault by the Israeli occupation forces, but it is the first time that humanity has witnessed a genocide playing out on live television. This isn't the first time we've seen war, this isn't the first time we've seen famine engineered by an occupying force, but this is the first time that in this era, when genocide was supposed to have been outlawed, when we were supposed to have evolved and developed to an international order in which such crimes against humanity were no longer possible, it is the first time that we are watching this level of impunity, this level of shamelessness, and this level of violence carried out at this scale for the entire world to see, for the entire world to witness. The last 6 months have been especially distressing for a lot of people who've been concerned, who are not just concerned about Palestine, but who hold any basic concern for humanity. And the violence that has been visited by the Israeli occupation forces is not just limited to the battlefields of Gaza. It's a violence that has been done to our language, to our imaginations, to our capacity for concern, to our capacity for compassion. And the occupation has not just placed its bet on its weapons and on its guns. It has actually placed its bets on the limits of our capacity to care, of humanity's collective capacity to care. And these 6 months have also witnessed a number of changes. These changes, not just in perceptions of how the United Nations is viewed, how international law is viewed, but also how people perceive authority and truth, how people understand what is a fact and what is propaganda. And we've seen in the last few years, while we've seen the destructive potential of social media and misinformation, these last 6 months have also given us a glimpse into what is possible when a large number of people around the world come together and decide that they won't be fooled by propaganda, they won't be fooled by lies, and they want to understand the truth, they want to understand the context. And repeatedly, when the Israeli occupation forces and their facilitators sitting in the United States and other countries have sought to limit the starting point of this so-called conflict to one date in October, when they have sought to frame this entire issue as a response to the crime of October 7th. Constantly we've seen not just experts and analysts, but millions and millions of young people, millions of ordinary people around the world come out and challenge this notion, come out and debunk this notion that October 7th was the starting point of anything. So today, as we come to 6 months of this brutal, horrific genocide that we are all collectively witness to, we think this is an appropriate moment to also step back, to continue to witness, to continue to call out, yes, but also to step back and try to understand why the Palestinians continue to resist. Why, when the entire world wants them to just forget and move on, they continue to fight. To take a look at the history of this occupation and what is it that has brought us to this moment today. Of course, this is a large and complicated topic and we do not have the time to delve into the entire history today. But still, it is important to have a basic context and a basic understanding. For instance, the entire narrative of legitimizing Israel, the entire narrative that seeks to downplay the effects of this occupation, is based on a few myths, a few ideas that popularly inform all sorts of journalism, all sorts of commentary on Palestine. The first myth is that the land that the Israelis occupy historically belonged to them, and it was an empty piece of land that was reclaimed by them, and that this land was awarded to them as a result of the crime of the Holocaust. The reality is that the Holocaust was the result of hundreds of years of persecution by European states against their Jewish population. And at the end of the Holocaust, instead of facing up to their crimes, the European powers, and especially England and the emerging superpower that was the United States, decided to solve their Jewish problem by expelling all Jews out of Europe in a convenient way and establishing a settler colony right in the heart of the Arab world. The second myth that is commonly bandied about is that this conflict, this so-called conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, is somehow a war between Muslims and Jews. When the reality that Palestinians again and again have been saying, and that has again and again been demonstrated in the last 6 months, is that Israel is not a Jewish project, but a European settler colonial project. We've seen, even in the last 6 months, the number of churches that have been bulldozed by this Israeli occupation. We've seen the number of Christians and Muslims who've been killed indiscriminately by Israeli bombs. And we've also seen the large number of Jews around the world who've had the courage to stand up and say that the state of Israel does not represent them. Because Israel is not a representative of global Judaism. Israel is a representative of European colonialism. And it is a product of directly a product of British colonial policies in the Arab world, and it is sustained not because the Jews have some sort of a monopoly over Europe, some sort of a control over European powers. The Israeli state and its occupation is sustained because the Israeli occupation furthers the interest of the Americans and the Europeans in controlling what happens in the Arab world. The Israeli state acts as a police of Europe and as a colonial outpost of American power especially. We have seen the current president of the United States, President Joe Biden, repeatedly say over his almost 50-year political career that Israel is so crucial to American interests that if an Israel did not exist, they would have to go and create a state of Israel and then support its existence. So the support that the Americans are showing to Israel is again not a product of Jewish influence or a product of a conflict between Islam and Judaism. It is a product of American interests in the region and a testament to the fact that the Israeli state continues to protect and serve the interests of the American power in the Arab world. A third myth that is commonly pushed by especially by US news outlets and by other geopolitical analysts around the world is that the Palestinians have repeatedly been offered a state, repeatedly been offered a solution, but they have failed to compromise, they have failed to settle this issue. And there is nothing that could be further from the truth. In fact, we have seen that over the years, even the Palestinian factions such as the PLO, who have come to the negotiating table, have only compromised on their demands, on their interests, and have not got anything in return. The Oslo Accords, or the so-called Middle East peace process, was not, as we know today, a good faith process, but in fact it was a process that was meant to dilute the Palestinian demand for a statehood and to give them a state that would exist without complete sovereignty, that would exist as a protectorate of the state of Israel. And the Oslo Accords specifically stated that Israel would not bear any of the costs, any responsibility for the costs of its occupation of Palestine. The Oslo Accords and the peace process that they initiated were meant for nothing else than to absolve Israel of all the crimes of its occupation and to ensure that the Palestinian liberation movement could get nothing more than a stunted, demilitarized state that would at best be a protectorate of the state of Israel. The irony of ironies is that the extreme right wing in Israel that is currently in power could not even digest this form, this limited, stunted form of Palestinian identity. And as they are openly and unapologetically saying to the entire world, their very intent is to rid the entire historical Palestine of every single Palestinian and establish their occupation power in those lands. Their stated intent is to carry out not just ethnic cleansing, but openly to carry out a genocide and to occupy all of the lands that constitute a historic Palestine. And in the last few years, another myth which has circulated very widely in newsrooms and in opinions by analysts is that Gaza was a territory that was freed by the Israelis, that was given by the Israelis for Palestinians to control, and they have failed to behave properly. They have failed to govern themselves properly, and they have fallen victim to the Islamists, etc., etc. And therefore, that seeks to legitimize and justify what the Israeli occupation forces have done for the last 20 years and what they continue to do in Gaza today. The reality is that when the Israelis left Gaza, it wasn't an act of decolonization. It was simply in response to a situation that was becoming untenable. It was simply a response to the fact that occupying Gaza had become difficult for them because the people of Gaza were resisting, because Hamas and other resistance movements in the Gaza Strip were gaining in strength and were making it difficult for Israel to maintain its direct occupation. That was the only reason the Israelis decided to withdraw from the Strip, but they never ceded control. In fact, under all tenets of international law, the fact that Israel controls everything that comes in or goes out of Gaza, that it controls how much electricity it gets, that it controls how much its people can eat, how much its people can drink, that it doesn't even allow the people of Gaza to have a seaport of their own that is controlled by them. All of this under international law means that Israel continues to be the occupying power, with the people of Gaza only having very limited powers of self-governance. Despite this limitation, despite living under a virtual open-air prison for at least the last 4 decades, it is remarkable that the people of Gaza have not given up their resistance. The people of Gaza have not given up fighting for their right of self-determination. And what we have seen is only a very natural and organic reaction of any people responding to a brutal and unending occupation. It is common for Western leaders and journalists to equate Hamas with terrorist organizations or with groups like ISIS, or to give them other names that convey that these are dangerous fanatical Islamic terrorists against whom Israel has no option but to carry out this sort of a brutal crackdown. And this is the same legitimizing tactic that was used by the Western powers in the global war on terror. It is the same tactic that has been co-opted by many different states around the world. And unfortunately, it is the same narrative that even in India is being appropriated and utilized by right-wing forces who are suddenly sprung up in support of Israel. The reality is that Hamas in the 1980s had begun initially as a civil disobedience movement. But when it continued to face crackdown, when it continued to face brutal crackdown from the Israeli occupation, the civil disobedience turned into resistance with knives and pickets and sticks, which progressed into guns, which steadily progressed into more advanced and involved weaponry. And as we all know, and as every nation, every people who have waged a war of resistance know, the weapons of the occupied always respond to the weapons of the occupier. Therefore, and even in the last few years, the attacks that Hamas has and the Palestinian resistance inside Gaza have carried out against Israel have been in response to very specific policies that Israel has been pursuing in the occupied territories. For instance, even in the current conflagration, why the October 7th incident that is frequently pointed to by all commentators around the world, the objectives that the Palestinian resistance set out with were very clear. Their main objective was to free the large number of political prisoners that Israel has taken over the last few years. In fact, the last few years have seen frequent protests, frequent outbreaks of non-violent civil disobedience by Palestinians living in the West Bank, living in different refugee camps around the occupied territories. And Israel has responded to it with a brutal crackdown of extrajudicial killings, of surveillance, and of taking people prisoner, and not just political activists, but children, youngsters, women as young as 14, 15 years old. And these large number of political prisoners has become a symbol of Israeli occupation of Palestine. And what Hamas and the entire Palestinian resistance did on October 7th, their stated intent and what they've continued to say till today, the reason they continue to negotiate for hostages till today, is to ensure that at least the most vulnerable, the youngest and most vulnerable of those political prisoners can be freed from the Israeli prisons. The large number of political prisoners inside Israeli prisons has become a symbol of not only Palestinian resistance but also of Israel's occupation of Palestine. And the stated intent of the Palestinian resistance on October 7th through their actions was to free these political prisoners who are languishing in the prisons of Israel. These are just some of the many myths about Palestine that have circulated for a large number of years and that have informed not just public commentary and public opinion, but policy making and the decisions of international actors and global powers on the issue of Palestine and Palestinians' right to self-determination. However, what we have seen in the last 6 months, even though it is horrific, even though it is bloodied, even though it will probably haunt us for our entire lifetimes, it has also led to a strange and remarkable realignment that no one could have predicted or postulated. While those who have a vested interest in the power structures of the Middle East right now, those who support ethno-nationalist genocidal movements in their own countries, continue to have sympathies with the state of Israel, the ordinary people around the world, public opinion around the world, even though it may not be very informed, even though it may not know the nuances of Palestinian history and the history of Israeli occupation, have intrinsically begun to see who is on the side of justice in this conflict. They have begun to see who is the oppressed and who is the oppressor. Ordinary people around the world are beginning to coalesce around a demand for justice for the Palestinian people, a demand for their right to return to their homelands, a demand for their right to live free and dignified lives. Today, as we approach 6 months of this brutal and horrific genocide, as we look on helplessly while women, children, and Palestinian men are mercilessly cut down, we may be able to do nothing more than bear witness to what they are doing. But even in that act of bearing witness, even in that collective coming together, at least we must ensure that we educate ourselves and that we stand on the right side of history. Thank you.